Hi again. So in this video, we're going to take a look at the different evaluative criteria you would use to evaluate popular sources. Now, next week we'll talk about scholarly peer-reviewed sources and books and ebooks, and they have a different criteria for evaluating, so we'll set that aside. What we're going to talk about this week are popular sources. And I'm using the word popular here in a very specific meaning. So this isn't popular in the sense that lots of people like it. It's popular more like the meaning of population. This is something for the general public. So you think about newspapers, national magazines, websites often affiliated with newspapers or magazines. So we may be thinking about things like the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, the Atlantic, Time, those kinds of publications, website for National Public Radio, other kinds of news. You might also include this group sources that are affiliated with certain websites or organizations. So the first criteria is authority. Here you want to evaluate the author and the publisher. So it's important to know who wrote the article, especially if you're going to quote that person. What can you find out about that person's credentials to write on the subject? If the person is an expert in a certain field and is writing a guest column, that would be important to know. Or if someone is an employee of a magazine or a newspaper, then that's an important part of establishing their credibility. But of course, the individual's credibility is really based on the company or organization that published the source. Now, in other cases, websites by the government agencies, as the .gov or educational institutions.edu or nonprofit organizations.org, their credibility may rest in different areas, but it is really important that you find out what you can about the organization that has published something, as well as the author. If you can't find information about the author or the publisher, then don't use the source. Chances are that there's misleading or probably even factual or information in there. Now, of course, the second criteria in choosing a source is going to be its relevance to your research question. So you begin with the top title. Does it sound like the information is relevant to your topic? Does it share keywords with your topic or your research question? And sources that we'll look at next week, peer-reviewed or scholarly sources, they may include a bibliography or reference list, and that's a good sign as far as telling how relevant the source is to your source. Same is true with books. You might look at the table of contents, the introduction, or just scan through the index to see how much of it applies to your source. Again, we'll talk about peer-reviewed articles and books in more detail next week. Third criteria is currency. Here, it's important to know when was the source published or written. And keep in mind, those aren't always the same thing. Sometimes a work may be written in the 1920s, but republished in 2018. It still was written in the 1920s, not necessarily a current response. So think about how important is the time of publication to your topic. In my field, English literature, it's not really that important. Something written in 1819 is as relevant as something written in 2019. But in most topics, especially if they concern medicine, science, finance, economics, law, the more recent the source, the better. So for this particular working bibliography assignment, I've confined that to sources since 2015. 5-6 years is probably, for a general topic, a good cutoff date. Finally, objectivity. Is the source, is the information factual or is it opinion? It's really important that you think in terms of what you're using the source for. If it's factual information and you can establish that it's a reliable source, have at it. It really doesn't matter. But if the source is offering opinion, then you need to decide, is it objective or neutral? Are multiple positions presented? So you may have to look at the article more closely than simply basing it on the title. So what we're looking for here is there any obvious bias. Now, in some cases, you can identify the bias based on the publication. So here I'm going to switch to a chart that we call a media chart. And this is included in Moodle if you want a better look at it. And there are many of these, and all of them are pretty similar. They may include different publications, but if you are doing a general or a popular source search, and you want to know, say for instance, is the source I'm looking at typically liberal or is it typically conservative, a chart like this would be helpful. So if you think in terms of some of the sources that you might use in your paper, the way this is set up is through the center here. This is sort of neutral or a minimal partisan bias or balance of biases. That is to say, there is a difference between not having a lot of bias or having a balance of biases. And what that second one means is that they typically present in their pieces, say, a liberal viewpoint offset by a conservative viewpoint. Publications that skew liberal or skew conservative are in this next category here. And then you see things like hyper-partisan or most extreme liberal and conservative and extreme conservative. As you go down the list, you'll see that at the top here we have original fact reporting. So if your source is something like the AP, the Associated Press, Reuters, Bloomberg, these are kind of news services. They sell the stories to newspapers that are published all over the world. Reuters, a European, AP, the kind of traditional American source for this. As you move down, you have fact reporting, and in this group, newspapers, some monthly or national magazines, or even websites like Politico, not really a print source, but an important website that reports on political issues in America. You also see as you move down here that some of these pieces move out. The Hill and Politico, probably very similar websites, but one skews conservative, one skews liberal. So it might be important if you're including if you're writing about an issue and you have an article from Politico, you might offset it by searching for the same topic and see if the Hill is reported on it or the Wall Street Journal. As you move farther down the list, you get complex analysis or analysis until you get to the point where you have selective, incomplete, or unfair persuasion. All right? So we have on the liberal side here something like Huffington Post, over on this side, the New York Post, or something like Fox News, which actually kind of tips down into what is identified here as propaganda, contains misleading information. And then, I think you can quite see it. Let me see if I can bring this up. At the very bottom on this particular list, I gotta bring it up. There we go. Are sources you would certainly want to stay away from in any situation. InfoWars or Newsmax on the really hyper-conservative side, the National Enquirer, which I think you understand its reputation from the news checkout line in grocery stores, and then some other similar ones that are on the extreme left side of this. All right, so that's how a media bias can help. At least you understand if you can anticipate that there's a bias within the publication itself. The idea being that these publications tend to take, at least in an editorial stance, either a conservative or liberal viewpoint. Now, let's take a look at a Google search, which I think a lot of you will be doing. And I'd begun one earlier. I was going to search on the topic of sports mascots controversy. I think I put that in first, but Google suggested this search, and so I kind of went with that. So I'm going to pull up one of the articles here. But just as you kind of go through here, looking at the publishers, the ncai.org. I think this is a college sports organization. The RAP, I'm not really familiar with that. But it may be a sports site. 538 often does report on sports. But let's take a look at this article here. Indians, Braves, and Chiefs, what now for U.S. sports, other Native American names. All right. So this was probably published back soon after the Washington Redskins decided to change their name to something else. Still don't know if they picked a new name. So they spent the season as the Washington NFL team or something. A Washington football team, I think, is what they refer to themselves as. All right. Regardless here, let's take a look at what we have. We have The Guardian as the publisher. Very important to understand that. If I switch to the media bias chart, find The Guardian, where would The Guardian be? Right here. All right. So it's right on that neutral or skews liberal side, and I think that represents The Guardian's point of view very well. One of the things I would find out if I did a search on The Guardian is that they're based in the United Kingdom. I think Manchester, England, and London are sort of the basis, sort of the home office for them. Do a lot of reporting in the U.S. though. The other thing I want to look for then is the reporter, Tom Lutz. Might click on that, see if I can find anything about him. See some of the other articles he's written. He has a Twitter account, but it is a name I could sort of search for more information, whether it's within The Guardian or maybe see if he has a Wikipedia page, something like that. But Lutz is, I think, a regular writer for The Guardian. So a combination then between we've identified the author, we've identified the publisher, now we look for currency. Well, 2020 is, certainly within the last year. If I'm writing about controversial mascot names, this is certainly taking on that aspect of, professional sports leagues in the United States that still use Native American names. So that certainly falls within the realm here. So would I include this on my working bibliography? Well, absolutely. I think it certainly satisfies at least 3 of the criteria that we've explored. I think you can see that if we look at things from the New York Times or USA Today, again, those are newspapers that we could certainly position them on the bias chart. Now, I get a number of things like Bleacher Report. These are sports publications, CNN, the LA Times, Global Sports Matters. So we see lots of people have written about it. Here's a source that seems to be French in origin. So all of these are things that I would keep in mind as I select, say, the 5 to 10 popular sources that I would be including on a working bibliography for this topic. Now, for the forum this week, you'll identify some sources for the research question you've been assigned, and then you'll also be asked what is the evaluative criteria you use to select that source, and this is what you'll reference back. Is it the author and the publisher, relevance to your topic, currency, or does it seem to be objective? Is the publisher identified as neutral or objective or close to it? Is the information factual? In which that case, you're not really concerned about the bias necessarily of the article. If you're reporting facts, they typically remain facts. It's the spin or interpretation of the facts that are different. All right, so look forward to seeing your forum and see what you've dug up with the topic you were given. Thanks.